welcome to Bharata First. You're watching the Discourse with me, Frank Pereira. Now, since you're here, I would like something from you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and also spread the word about your favorite channel, Bharata First. That's it, nothing more. And for those who would be interested, we have a membership program with great perks. Check them out by hitting the join button on the YouTube page. The Lok Sabha on July 26th passed a bill that seeks to exempt land within 100 kilometers of the country's borders from the purview of the forest conservation laws and permits setting up of zoos, safaris, and ecotourism facilities in forest areas. The Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023 was passed after a brief debate, which was responded to by the Environment Minister, Bhupender Yadav. Now, the bill exempts certain types of land from provisions of the Act, such as forest land along a rail line or a public road maintained by the government providing access to a habitation or to a rail and roadside amenity up to a maximum size of 0.1 hectare. In this edition of the Discourse, we will analyze the pros and cons of the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023. Joining me on the program today are Ashok Pai, former Principal Chief Conservator of Forests, Uttarakhand; Mr. Bimbadar Pradhan, former Secretary, Government of India and retired IAS officer, as well as Urvi Goswami, environment journalist and assistant editor of the Economic Times. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of the Discourse. Mr. Pai, let me start the program first with you. I mean, with your vast experience with forest lands, with forest dwellers right through your career, I'd like to know how you look at this bill, because there has been quite a bit of pushback as well from certain sections of society. Do you think that at some level those pushbacks are justified?
I think the context in which this amendment has been brought has to be understood first. We need to realize that when the Forest Conservation Act was introduced in 1980, the intent was rampant diversion of forest land for non-forestry use, and that was about 4 million prior to that one, between 50s and early 80. And the intent was that there should be regulation of the diversion of the land, because environment is ultimately right to life is the issue involved here. Subsequently, when certain PILs were there in the Honorable Supreme Court, Trimal Badi Godavarman case, the Godavarman case, so to say, the nature of forest classification, which was ambiguous in certain areas, has been extended by the Apex Court, saying that even the unclassed forest should be brought under the category of under the ambit of Forest Conservation Act, so that the entire forest gets the shield from the Forest Conservation Act and then diversion to non-forest use. Years after that, there were attempts in significantly during those periods of 70s, late 70s and 80s, there were social forestry programs where an attempt was made to extend the forest areas by planting the roadsides and avenues, irrigation canals, the land which were primarily acquired by these agencies for construction of roads or irrigation canals, or the linear projects, so to say. Those small pieces of excess land which was there, their construction, the trees were planted too. But unfortunately, they came under the category of the shield of the Forest Conservation Act because of the regulation of these the Supreme Court's orders on interpretation of the forest subsequently. And that caused a bit of a problem for interpretation. Using that piece of land which was procured by these agencies for the either linear projects and extending those things. Simultaneously, when on one hand we were trying to encourage people to plant trees, there were issues of cutting and felling these things. And if you're bringing it, the nature of the forest interpretation in this manner, even the cutting of trees and by the private agencies would be difficult, and in that manner, it cannot be encouraged, and it will work as a disincentive. The other aspect of it was that even the silvicultural operations or the forestry operations were brought under the ambit of Forest Conservation Act. Thereby, even that became difficult, and then at places there had to be certain measures taken, which were not very ethical, I would say, to do that one. And for example, there were other related issues like the basic infrastructure of forest posts, check posts, and the staff quarters, communication, and the forest roads, etc. All of that came under the ambit of the Forest Conservation Act. And even though some states did construct these things, but it was done surreptitiously. So those were the kind of issues which tried to be addressed, because the deemed classification or dictionary meaning of the forest created some sort of a distortion, the purpose of which was not intended that kind of a manner. And some of those issues are most of these issues are being addressed through this amendment. And to a certain extent, there are issues which are of debatable nature, which there are concerns expressed. And
Right.
there has been, a few quarters have been talking about it. And perhaps there is enough merit in those things as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll come back to that in the next round and try and discuss those issues as well, and what else this bill really addresses. But before that, let me go to Mr. Pradhan. Mr. Pradhan, how would you look at this particular bill? How would you measure out the pros and cons?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think though I am not an expert on the subject of forest and environment, but being a generalist, whatever comes to my mind, as common sense, what is the background of this bill? If you take the argument between, say, the environmentalist and the policy makers as a development expert, then the debate starts. And if you take the 1980 Forest Act, that is a milestone. I am not going into 1927 or 1986, but the Act of 1980 is a crucial piece of legislation for conservation of the forest. I am not going into the key provisions of 1980. And if you take a comparative picture of 1980 and the Forest Conservation Act of 2023, to some extent, to my mind, the bill of 2023 is a progressive legislation. Now the question is, if you look from the prism of a conservationist, then you will have certain reservations. But if you look purely from development point of view, from national security point of view, from strategic projects point of view, from the problems of the left-wing extremism areas point of view, then definitely you will have a correct balance of the bill of 2023. Therefore, I will come to those issues, the exemptions, but to start with, what is the lens of your prism? If you are a forest conservationist or an environmentalist, your interpretation of the bill will be different. But if you are looking purely from progressive point of view, from forward-looking point of view, as a developmental expert, your views will be definitely progressive and forward-looking in the dynamic situation. Keeping our national targets, keeping our commitment for net neutrality by 2070, keeping all those climate change issues, definitely there are certain concerns and challenges. But to my mind, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at national security, definitely it is a progressive piece of legislation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for putting those things into perspective for us, Mr. Pradhan. Urmi Goswami, you heard the gentleman before you. How would you look at this particular bill? Because, let's not forget that India is a developing country, growing country, and developing in a fast-changing world as well. There are certain new realities that we have to come to terms with. So from that perspective, would you say that this is a welcome piece of legislation?
You know, one of the biggest problems that any policymaking or legislative exercise faces in India, and I presume this is a challenge that is faced by many developing countries, and to some extent you see it even in developed countries, but definitely in developing countries, and more so in countries like India, which, as you mentioned, are fast growing, and is that we still are at that place where we believe that there are different pulls and pushes, or let's put it this way, there are different intentions, and there is a hierarchy of intentions. So it's development, then strategic, and then say livelihood issues, and then finally environment. And yet our lived reality tells us something very different. Our lived reality tells us that we can no longer have a view of the world, a policy making that has a hierarchy of priorities, but instead we have to look at basically of interlocking priorities. Therefore, you cannot be having a conversation on strategic interests without considering environmental factors. Now, let me give you a very quick example. You know, the bill, I know that we're going to come to the exemptions in a later part of the program, but just to say why that interlocking approach is necessary, is it gives an exemption for strategic construction, whether it's roads. Let's just stick to roads in border areas. Imagine that you're constructing roads in border areas, say in the Himalayan range or in the Northeast. You cannot be having a conversation without considering the environmental impacts, the forestry impacts. So the question, I think the problem with this bill, and I think a different approach could have to some extent helped not have these vast divides, is an understanding that there are different priorities, but there is no hierarchy of priorities. How can we best meet all the needs? The road that has to be built in the Himalayan region cannot be bereft of understanding the ecosystem it is built in. So therefore, you may not need a lengthy system of clearance, but there has to be a system whereby the checklist, what is the clearance about? The clearance is about, it's not, this is also part of the Indian problem, that everything becomes like a red tape exercise, a bureaucratic red tape exercise. But the forest clearance or an environmental clearance is not about red tape. It ends up being about red tape, but it's about ensuring a certain integrity of a project, in the sense that it will not harm, and if there is an alteration made, measures are taken to counterbalance the alterations that are happening. Now, if you're going to build a road at the border area, you do want it to be the best possible road, which doesn't just vanish at the first extreme rain event, or does not suffer from a landslide. You will need these checks and balances for that. Is the forest cover, what benefit does the forest cover bring? Because we're talking in terms of Forest Clearance Conservation Act. What benefit does it bring? Is there a way to protect this benefit and make the strategic infrastructure that is required? I think these are the questions that need to be addressed. I firmly believe that if we stop looking at competing priorities, but look at a complex web of priorities, we will be better off in making our laws. I think there's a biggest problem that any ecological, actually most laws which have implications or interactions with the environment face in this country. And I think that's why I'm not very comfortable saying that whether it's progressive or regressive. I just think that we are trying to solve a 21st century, we are trying to solve certain 20th century problems with 20th century language, but we are situated in a 21st century context, which basically means we cannot be making any decisions in terms of law which do not take into account the fact that this is a world that is in the middle of serious ecological crises, whether it's biodiversity loss or climate change or pollution. And finally, just one more thing. I think part of the problem that we face is that there isn't enough proper conversation. I think I know that there was a joint parliamentary committee. There was a lot of letter writing that happened, a lot of representations made. But I think if consultations happened better, we would have probably a better understanding of where each one is coming from. Again, it's our approach. Are these competing interests, or are these sort of interests which are complex interests, different facets of the same interest?
Absolutely. Let me take the points that you're making forward now. Let me play devil's advocate, Mr. Pai. Some very valid points there made by Urmi Goswami. We have a hierarchy really as far as these needs are concerned, and environment seems to be coming right at the bottom of this hierarchy, and that is a major cause for concern, because let's not forget, global warming is real. We are seeing an increase of rainfall in about 5%, but the entire nation is flooding as a result of that. That is as a result of global warming, as a result of forests being destroyed. And just to bring in another point, you have deforestation, say, in the Andamans, but you have afforestation in a place like Haryana. The ecosystems are completely different. How is this really going to benefit? How would you look at this particular issue, Mr. Pai?
There is a lot of merit in the earlier panelist was talking about, which is what is being attempted through the checks and balances, which is required in any legislation or any process which has been introduced as a public policy, so to say. Yes, it is presumed that there won't be any blanket permission for construction of the roads along the LOC or LAC, because it is these are the ecologically fragile areas, and we have just experienced what has happened in Himachal recently or Uttarakhand recently, and time and again these keep reminding us, and that is, one has to be very wary of these aspects while going for the finer aspects of it, while you frame the rules and the guidelines subsequent to what has been already approved by the Lok Sabha, and perhaps it will go through the Rajya Sabha as well. The intention, other than the ecological, the sensitivity or the fragility of these areas, the other aspects of it is that it should not lead to fragmentation of the habitats and the corridors, thereby leading to more of man-animal conflict and the decrease of biodiversity or questioning the survival of certain species, and those kind of issues do come in. The other aspect is that which is generally not noticed is that many states, about 20-25% of the forest cover is not classified. For example,
Yes.
has about 17,000 square kilometers of forest cover, of which only about 750 square kilometers is classed as the forest. And similarly, there's Abujmad area in the central India and Odisha. There are a whole lot of this thing, Aravalis, for example. These are the areas where perhaps the shield which has been protected by the Godavari case, if it is removed, there is apprehension that all these areas may vanish and there will be rampant construction and diversion of this forest may happen. That's why the question of the checks and balances is very important, and what you lay down as fine print or the conditionalities, as they call it, in according to the sanctions, etc., they become very critical, and how they are executed. That is the essence of the whole balance between the trade-off between the environmental necessities and the economic realities of the developing nations. There are a few other issues as well which need to be considered. For example, construction of zoos, safaris, and the tourism infrastructure in the forest areas. That is a very debatable and bit of a controversial. Why it should be allowed in the forest area when most of the national parks are the protected areas. These infrastructure have come up in the private land and doing fairly well. Why the limited resource of forest land or the forest cover should be allowed, even if it is the degraded forest, and that becomes a becomes a sort of a real challenge, and there has to be very, very careful treating on this aspect of it, setting up of these tourism infrastructure or the zoos and safaris.
Absolutely. Yeah,
The
please go
other
ahead.
issue which has been which needs to be considered is with regard to the some of the protections provided by the constitution and subsequent legislations to the tribal communities. For example, the PESA or the Forest Rights Act, or the some of the shields provided in the Land Acquisition Act, which has been, and Wildlife Act per se. These are the Wildlife Act is for the biodiversity point of view, whereas the other three are with regard to giving special care to the less articulate and less exposed communities who are dependent on the forest for their livelihood. There has to be a sort of a consultation mechanism, which was provided in the PESA and the FRA. So also in the Land Acquisition Act, which has been done in the last tenure of the UPSC. So those are the concerns which need to be addressed, while I'm sure that will be taken care in the rules when they are framed, or the guidelines which are issued, so that there is a adequate checks and balances, and that is how the public policy or any legislation moves in. Otherwise, there will be a free for all situation, and I'm sure these issues would be concerned. The agroforestry aspect, which is very important in the sense that we have a commitment under the Paris Agreement, and wherein we are promising to sequester carbon at a particular level, and this thing. So that can happen only, one of the ways is by having the trees or the forest cover outside the forest land, because forest is a limited resource. Land, there is a competing demand for the land. Forest land is very scarce resource, and there cannot be beyond a level, it can't be extended, the covers, etc. So to encourage that one, agroforestry is the way forward, where this issue has been taken care in the amendment proposed, and that should encourage more people on the private land to plant the trees and sequester carbon, and meet our the carbon emission requirements, so to say.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Pai, for taking us through all those other issues as well that needs to be taken care of, especially in the finer details of the rules and guidelines, and that's where it's going to really be key. All right, Mr. Pradhan, you were speaking about exemptions, concerns, and challenges. If we can talk about that as well.
So basically, what is the background or what is the intent of this bill? That I think, in the preliminary discussion, we have elaborated in great detail. But if you take the State of Forest Report 2021, approximately 28% of the India's recorded forest cover, roughly, if I can give a figure, 197,159 square kilometer of the forest, out of total 7,13,789 square kilometer is not recorded as forest. Whatever may be the issues, whether we didn't conduct the ground survey as intended, but somehow 28% of the forest cover is not being in the public domain. Whether it is being used as agricultural land, that is an issue. So some of these anomalies were supposed to be sorted out through extensive ground survey, but the process remained incomplete. And it is only, the experts on forest and environment may highlight why it has been, remained incomplete. And look back to the 1996, what Supreme Court did, that the felling of trees across the country, they suspended. and ruled that the Forest Conservation Act would apply to all land parcels that were either recorded or resembled as a forest. This sweeping order of the Honorable Supreme Court helped to check the rampant deforestation. However, it prevented the exclusion of vast areas already used for agriculture or as homestead. Therefore, this 1996 Honorable Supreme Court judgment also, one of the triggers why we are bringing this kind of a bill in 2023. And let's go back to the 2022. Again, the government of India also introduced they brought some changes to the rules in 2022. Though I am not quite well conversant with those changes. Therefore, in this 2023, there are exemptions. What are those exemptions? To my mind, one is within 100 kilometers within our international borders. That may have implications on the forests, on the biodiversity, and on the indigenous community, maybe in the Himalayan region, maybe in the northeastern region. And you are mentioning about the Andaman Nicobar also. So whatever is important from national defense point of view, from strategic point of view, from security point of view, that may have implications on our forests, on our ecology, on our indigenous community. What ma'am was flagging, that is not ruled out. Now, where is the balance? Therefore, if I have to conclude in 2-3 lines, our process must be transparent. Our process must consult the stakeholders, whether it is a tribal community of Abusmari or tribal community of, say, Daltonganj, or tribal community of Bastar, or tribal community of, say, Koraput. Given those, eco-fragile areas, given those eco-sensitive areas, whether it is in the Tarai belt or whether it is in the northeastern belt, there must be relevant and requisite consultation process with the stakeholders, and whatever we do, whether from development point of view or from conservation point of view, we must consult the stakeholders, and specifically the tribal communities and the indigenous communities. For them, if I have to put only 3 words at the ground level, it is Jal, it is jungle, and it is Jamin. It should be the fulcrum in our consultation process. Thank you.
All right, let's take the discussion forward from here. Urmi, so we're talking about rules, guidelines, and how we have to take a closer look at the finer details. So
Right.
what kind of rules and regulations would you say would be ideal in a 21st century kind of setting? Because you said earlier in your remarks that we are trying to address 21st century problems with with technology, with language from the previous century.
Right. Here's the thing. If we start looking at it, I mean, that would take us a long time to go through the disaggregate, what needs to be done where. But I think to put it very simply, as both Mr. Pai and Mr. Pradhan have put it, there is a need to, which they're talking about in terms of consultation. To me, I would have preferred if the consultations in the main had happened much earlier, right before the bill, before we went into this amendment. Having failed to do that, as they rightly pointed out, when we do the rules, the consultations need to be clear. Now, just to sort of give a little bit of a background, the very fact that both your speakers have pointed out that in 1980 the Forest Conservation Act was brought in simply because there was a lot of forest that was being diverted for non-forest. There was deforestation basically at a rapid pace. Now the reason why that was therefore the Forest Conservation Act was brought in. The fact of the matter is that there again were serious issues and which again we saw being resolved in the Godavarman case. The fact of the matter remains that implementation of any law in this country has been a worrying cause, and that I'm concerned that unless and until you have very clear cut, now there's only so much clear cut you can do, but much better defined laws, better defined rules and regulations, we are still going to end up having these problems. Mr. Pai mentioned about zoos, safaris, and ecotourism being sort of, you don't no longer need clearance for that. Now you wonder why such a move, and you then think the way the things are proceeded in this country, we are going to have another rampant problem. It's almost like we are not foreseeing. Perhaps the best thing to do right now would be to actually get all the experts in and say, look, we have this law, perhaps it's not perfect, let's try and fix it. I don't expect any government to say it's not perfect, but let's try and make it better, and start having the conversation about how to meet these diverse needs. There's the Forest Rights Act. Both your speakers have pointed to the need to protect the forest, about the Forest Rights Act, the PESA Act. How do we manage those acts with the need to conserve forests and to prevent deforestation and meet other needs? Now that is how the rules should be looking at. What are the steps and measures that we need to bring? And that can only happen by getting the real experts in domain experts, sociological experts. This is a conversation we need to have. Having amended the rules, what do we do next? How do we ensure that more things don't slip in the cracks? One exemption that we haven't spoken about yet, and which I would like to flag, is the fact that the central government can now decide what activities can be considered be exempt from all this clearance. So tomorrow you could have some mining, so critical minerals mining, that could fall into the exempt category. My concern is that without prejudice, this kind of exemption without very clear defined boundaries, which should be one general boundaries which should have been set in the bill, and then specific boundaries for specific projects, we will have what has happened periodically in this country, a lot of abuse of the law. I mean, the gap between what's on paper and what happens, and intent. So intent and on paper versus what happens on the ground and practice is huge in this country. Consider the other thing is that if you go back and look at the parliament, the Lok Sabha passage of the bill, when the minister stands up, the first thing he says, which I think Mr. Pai also referred to here, is the fact that India in 2015, India committed to adding additional 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestration of it. But if you look at the figure between 2015 and 2022, the addition of carbon sequestration that has happened through our forests is only 730 million hectares. 700 million tons, 730 million tons of carbon equivalent sequestration capacity. That means basically the 2.5 to 3 billion that we pledged under the Paris Agreement in our NDC will by 2030 will be difficult to meet. But what have we done with this law? We have taken about 28% of forested area and put it out of the purview of the law. We are talking about bringing plantations, but imagine you have put 28%, that's more than a quarter of forested areas outside the purview. There's a lot of things that don't seem to tally. I mean, ideally, actually, this conversation needs to happen to be ready to be relooked in the law, but relooking the law, but I don't expect that to happen. So now we have to try and start fixing things through the rules and regulations. And that means technically having the same level, a much higher level of consultation in which conservationists and environmentalists and scientists do not look askance at the government, and the government doesn't look askance at them, actually
Sure.
work in it as a partnership. I think that's the part of the story that's missing.
All right, then it's time now to get quick closing comments with the best way forward and what next. Let's put the cherry on top, so to speak, of this enlightening discussion. Mr. Pai, let me start with you first.
Yes. So as we discussed, the rules and the guidelines which would be framed under the new amended act should provide for consultative process and due diligence. To the extent possible, the technology should be used so that speed in decision making can be incorporated in there. More importantly, for large scale projects, even if it is the linear project for the LOC and LAC, there could be a provision made wherein the proponent department of due diligence submits a proposal which can be treated as deemed approval after 30 days or 60 days sort of a time. So there is a vetting of some these things. So otherwise, the proponent department may try and bring in the proposals which are not ecologically very friendly, and alternative ways of or the alternative alignments of the roads could be explored. So that should be the emphasis. That should not lead to fragmentation of the habitats, especially of the protected areas. Corridor should not be impacted. And most importantly, the fragile ecosystems of the Himalayas or the Western Ghats and Andaman Nicobar, they should be the key factor while having a trade-off by giving go-ahead or as a part of conditionality of the approval, even if it is deemed or exempted ones. So that can be incorporated. Consultation, transparency, speed in decision making, and the environmental fragility and biodiversity, they should be the keywords in the rules and the regulations which are likely to be framed after this, and that should be the way forward, I presume. And with the inputs, I'm sure the government would be equally concerned to bring in their aspects because of what is happening in and around, as I mentioned about Himachal or Uttarakhand or any other part of the country. It has happened few days back or in the past also. So that should be our key concern while executing these projects or giving these framing these rules.
Absolutely. Transparency, consultation, and that's what's going to be key as far as framing these rules and guidelines are concerned. Let's see how that is taken forward. Mr. Pradhan, your closing comments.
Thank you, sir. I think now this August House, sir, we are well conversant with the challenges relating to ecology, challenges relating to indigenous community, and challenges relating to our biodiversity, whether it is the Trans-Himalayan region or the fragile eco-sensitive area of Northeast. Given those challenges relating to ecology and our international and national commitments, so far as the sustainable development goals are concerned, whether it is net zero by 2070 or whatever commitments we have for 2030. Given those issues and concerns, I will pose 3 or 4 questions. Will the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill contribute to combat climate change issues or concerns? This is a bigger question. This is left to be pondered and also answered as we evolve. 2, will it contribute to net zero emission by 2070? 3, how to achieve that very national target or our commitment by 2070, and also whatever is feasible by 2030. Last, how to maintain and enhance the forest carbon stock. That is also a key question that needs to be answered. And if I have to say something or my reservation, about this very amendment, we must, what Ashok Pai sir was mentioning, it is transparency, it is consultation, but I will add one more, how to empower the communities in the whole process of environmental clearance or the issues of conservation or the issues of forest rights. At the end of the day, the amendment bill of 2023 and its impact on forests, on biodiversity, and on indigenous community, that should be the fulcrum in our deliberations and discussions. And we must have transparent rules through consultative process. Thank you.
Absolutely. Very well said. All right. Urmi Goswami, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So beyond the climate change commitments, that is the commitments we have made under the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, there's also the Global Biodiversity Framework, which we agreed to in Montreal last year, which is 30% by 2030. These are international commitments we have made. So those are on one side. Then there are our strategic needs, our needs to speed up clearance processes or the regulatory process, which is a problem that's being faced by many countries in the world. How do you speed up without undermining the integrity of the process? And finally, it's about addressing other developmental needs, which are also defined by the first two. So therefore, even if communities in these areas, if they're not their ecological needs, the ecological sanctity of their area is not maintained, there's a problem. But and two is if they're strategic, if they're not safe because of their location, that also is important. You cannot have ecological sanctity without security. So you need all those things. Now, the process that we do build up now, the law has been made. We have to step in with the rules. In these rules, we have to ensure that these three baskets are treated with equally. And for that, to echo Mr. Pai, we need rules that are transparent. We need consultation in the decision-making process. And those consultations need to be done with integrity, and they should be widespread, unlike what we have had happen in the past. And finally, the bigger piece and the biggest missing link in our sort of practice has been implementation. So we need oversight to ensure that the implementation happens. So you could have the best consultative process, you could have the best plan, but when it comes to implementation, there is a failure. And that is where we need to step up. How do you train people who are on the ground implementing systems under the purview of this law? And how do we rectify? As we start implementing, we'll realize that there are loopholes or there are gray areas. How do we start correcting them? So there has to be an oversight, both for implementation and for the understanding and the sort of elaboration of the law in practice. I think that is one piece of the puzzle that needs to be addressed with a great deal of seriousness. And I think that is critical, implementation.
We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much to all the panelists for joining me on the discourse and putting things into perspective for us. Much appreciate your time. So what's coming out of this discussion is that the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023 is a step in the right direction and tries to address some real on-ground problems. On paper, everything looks good, but the real deal is going to be in the rules and guidelines and how they are framed. Could these rules and guidelines have been brought in along with the bill itself is a question that needs pondering, because this is a very, very serious issue. There are to be proper checks and balances that we need to ensure that in the name of development, we don't damage the fragile ecosystem. This is what the rules and guidelines need to keep in mind. What we need going forward is thorough consultation and transparency. But most importantly, we need to focus on empowering the indigenous tribes of forest dwellers and safeguard their rights. That is going to be of utmost importance. We also need to take the whole community along if we have any chance of achieving our climate targets and making a Bharata of our dreams. That's it on this edition of the Discourse. But since you made it this far, please do support us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And we also have a membership program with great perks for you. So check them out by hitting the join button. Don't forget, also, before I go, let me remind you to spread the word about Bharata First so that more people get to know about us. You can be our brand ambassadors. And until next time, this is Frank Rausen Pereira signing off.